Hello, my name is Thomas, open source software engineer and person who's in a consistent existential crisis. And today I'm going to learn you a teach about how I made this terminal plugin Anki add-on combo thing. I'm going to assume that the people watching this are at least somewhat technical and know generally how to code and all of the basic concepts. And let's just jump into it. Okay, let's start with the terminal plugin first, because that's the easiest to explain. So you have this device, which is the terminal, and it makes a GET request to some web server, and the web server returns an image. Now you can host this web server yourself, but to make things easier, the terminal company hosts their own web server, and on the web server, you can create custom plugins. So terminal plugins, what they basically are is a bunch of markup. So if we go into the dashboard here, we can edit the markup. Before that, let's just scroll down to see all of the options we have. So strategy, you can have it be polling, webhook, or static. We are doing a webhook, so somewhere else is going to call this server with data. Polling is the server will, at some recurring interval, call a different server or a different place. We don't do polling. I was looking at how I could make polling work because that would be easier for bunch of other reasons. For instance, if I could do polling, I could create form fields here, and instead of configuring the Anki add-on using Anki, you can configure it within the terminal web UI. But the thing is that Anki is a desktop app. So if you wanted to do polling, you need a way to expose Anki to the internet. Of course, you don't want to do that directly. So what you would have to do is you would probably need to install Anki Connect into Anki, which exposes some API. And then using Anki Connect, you create your own web server somewhere, and you'll probably have to put it on your own server and then use Cloudflare Tunnel to expose it on some public endpoint on the internet. That seems like way too much work. That seems like a bit more of a security risk than I would like for some stupid little project. So that's why I did webhook. It's much easier. Now let's look at the markup. So we click edit markup, and you can see that there are 5 different tabs here. Now this is because we can have multiple plugins on terminal being shown at the same time, and you can organize them in different ways. So this is what it would look like if you just have the single plugin displayed on terminal, and then half view, yeah, it's self-explanatory really, quarter view, what it looks like. So there's different markup specifically for the different types of views, and there's a shared markup that's shared by all views. Now, the markup, you can see it's HTML, but it uses Liquid syntax. Liquid syntax is made by Shopify. I don't really know it. There's documentation. I don't know. I just learned what I needed to use. So the terminal server provides us with a bunch of variables that we could use for the Liquid syntax. And then using the webhook as a post request, we could give the terminal server more variables that it will use to populate this template. Now, what happens is that this template is first parsed, populated, and then it's run. What that means is that we'll go through all this JavaScript code later, but what that means is that you can template out what the variables will be inside of the JavaScript code. So this is what I'm doing. So I actually pass in a variable called compressed. This is because the terminal server has a 2 kilobyte request size limit. So what I'm actually doing in the Anki add-on is compressing the data before I send it, but we'll see that when we get there. Now, as you're looking at this code, you might see that everything is inside of a DOM content loaded event listener. Now that is because when the template is rendered and it's actually in the process of generating the image, if your code is touching upon the HTML, it needs to wait until the HTML is finished generating before it can do anything to modify it. Now, why is everything in the event listener instead of, let's say, just like the part that modifies the code? Why is even the function definitions in the event listener? And that's because of this thing, which, wow, it was such a throwback, but I was reminded of ifs in JavaScript. this isn't really a true iffy, I guess. Is this a true iffy? I mean, it is an anonymous function, but this is basically an iffy because when you have multiple plugins being displayed, terminal is taking all of the shared code and prepending it to the final template, which means that if you have multiple function definitions like populate that's outside of the event listener, you're going to have multiple definitions in the final generated post-templated HTML JavaScript thing, which will break everything if you have more than one instance of the plugin showing. So something to keep in mind is that if you want to be able to have multiple instances of your plugin side by side, to always have it in basically an iffy so that you contain all of your code into one static thing. This is also why I have the terminal plugin settings dot instance name here to really make sure that when I'm writing these instance specific code, that I am only targeting the instances, the one thing that I actually care about. So for instance, the style here, I have it so that you have this little attribute that is the instance name attribute, instance name being the whatever name you gave the plugin. And of course, this style thing is also templated. So I just templated out the instance name, and this will be pre-populated to Anki in this instance. So that's a quick overview of what a plugin really is in terminal. And I'll go through the rest of the code a little bit later after I explain the Anki portion of it. So let's go to VS Code real quick. So this is what an Anki add-on looks like. Anki add-ons are written in Python, although you don't really need to write it in Python. What you could do is that Anki uses PyQt, and PyQt exposes a WebView component, and you could load in a single page application using the WebView. So theoretically, you could code your entire add-on as a single page application in HTML JavaScript using all your favorite frameworks, and then just have a bridge as your Anki add-on that just loads the web view. I've done that before. It was pretty cool. I've also done it where I used Electron, and the Anki add-on literally launches an entire crazy Electron app. That was nuts. I would not do that again though. Anyway, so this is what the add-on currently looks like. I have a bunch of data classes here that define basically the shape of the configuration in Anki. The configuration looks something like this. There's a refresh rate, could be a string, could be a number. That I made it so that it takes both. And then you have the plugins, which is an array of objects that takes these fields. Data classes, they just let me be able to type things correctly, and autocomplete is nice, things like that. Also lets me make sure that I can override things and set defaults. Next up, we have this function to compress text. So I saw that someone was actually making a terminal Japanese plugin, and this thing actually takes from gshow.org. Now, if I remember correctly, gshow's API has been, for the past 10 years, in beta. And I've been waiting for those 10 fucking years for it to not be in beta. Still in beta, but apparently this person pings the API something. Basically, this is word of the day for Japanese, but I wasn't making word of the day for Japanese. I was making a terminal Anki plugin add-on thing that could act as a word of the day if you wanted it to, but it was super generic, so it doesn't even have to be every day. Anyways, so since I want to be able to support multiple instances of a terminal plugin, in this case, plugin is referring to the actual web UI terminal plugin thing. You can see here I have 3 instances of the terminal plugin here. I created a class in Python that's basically a reflection of what I need to do to interact with that plugin. So this is class terminal plugin. It takes in some terminal plugin configuration, which is basically the webhook, and also how to find the notes. So you can query using basic Anki search query syntax. And when you get a new note, it will call a webhook, which is the plugin. It'll compress things into a payload and then send it off to the server. And this happens at some recurring interval that you can configure, which we'll get to. Now, when this sends off to the server, this does not mean that your terminal device updates. It just means that the server has new information to be able to generate the image when the device asks for it. So it is possible to waste a lot of compute power if, for instance, you have this plugin set up to send data to the terminal server every 5 minutes. Meanwhile, you only have your terminal device updates every hour or so. So it's really important to keep those two things in sync so you never miss any flashcards. Yeah, and this is the refresh terminal plugin, which is just getting the new note and then calling the webhook with that note. Now, here's where the interesting part comes in, which is the actual terminal Anki class. So this is representing the actual Anki add-on itself. Now, it takes the configuration that it gets when Anki loads, creates all of the terminal plugin instances, and then it starts. When it starts, it spins up a background thread. Yep, we are going into multi-threaded programming. God damn it, I hate everything. So it spins up a Python thread, and it uses this Python library called schedule to schedule a job every whatever seconds, and after every whatever seconds, it refreshes terminal. Now, schedule isn't like a cron job runner. It doesn't actually run the job. You still need to execute the pending jobs. All it does is that if you call run pending, it'll, I don't know, I guess, check the time or some shit and then say, oh, these things need to be run now. It's like past their due date. So you spin up a background thread, and then every second it'll run pending schedule jobs. So most of the time this will be nothing, and then once the refresh rate goes over, it'll then run that job. Oh yeah, and we also set it to be a daemon because, of course, we don't want this background thread to prevent Anki from closing, because that would suck. Anyways, we have another function here called refresh config. This is used in an Anki hook, which we'll get to, but basically if the config changes, we will check to see if the config is this Anki add-ons configuration, and if it is, it'll load the configuration and then regenerate everything and then recreate the background job. And if it isn't, or if there's some error in the config JSON, it will just return the text. It'll basically pass through because this is a hook. Refresh terminal async. Now this one's weird. Of course, when you're debugging, or let's say you just installed the add-on and the plugin, you want to be able to just tell it to refresh. Of course, you can't do that using the other code because it's running in a background thread and it's running a scheduled job. So how do you tell the scheduled job to run immediately? Honestly, now that I think about it, there probably is something in the schedule library that's just run all jobs immediately. I actually did not look at that. Whoops. But what I'm doing right now is that in Anki, you have this thing called a query op, and a query op is basically a helper function that spins up some background thread for you, and it's specifically for when you're querying the Anki database. So that's what I'm using right here because it's the most idiomatic for writing Anki add-ons, and it's just refreshing terminal. Now, query op cannot run in a background thread, which sucks because, like, I would really like if refresh terminal was only one function instead of two, and I could probably do this. I could probably check to see if I'm in the main thread or not, and then just run query op if I am in the main thread. Things like that. I didn't really look into this because, again, I was just, I don't know, being a fucking dumbass. And there's a shutdown function to stop the background thread. But that was all just class and function definition stuff. Over here is where the add-on is actually initialized. So first, we instantiate the class, and it gets the configuration from Anki and does all the setup stuff, instantiates the terminal plugins, things like that. And then what we do is we modify the Anki UI a little bit. So we're creating a queue action, we title it refresh terminal, and then we give it a trigger. We basically say if it's pressed, we want to refresh terminal async. So this will use the query op to query things in the background, and then it will refresh the terminal. And we add that as an action into the menu toolbar thing. So if we go into Anki here and go into tools, there's a refresh terminal menu button thingy. Also don't look at my Anki. It's been a while since I used this thing. Yeah, I was stuck in a desert, and then I was stuck on a volcano. So I'm just glad to be alive, but I have not been studying Japanese in a while. Next up is that I go into the Anki hooks, and then I detect if some configuration was updated, and then it calls the refresh configuration, which does all the config stuff, which I said before. And then what I do is that I make sure that Anki is initialized before I actually start the background thread and everything, because there's like, weirdness, race conditions, weird things that could happen. The collection might not have been initialized yet. You might not have a database connection, things like that. And then I have a hook listener thing that just shuts down everything, turns off the thread when Anki closes. And that's basically how this Anki add-on works. At some recurring interval, it will go through all the terminal plugin instances. It'll grab some random note according to some search query. It will compress the note so that it fits underneath 2 kilobytes. Now, is the card actually underneath 2 kilobytes? I'm not checking for that right now. So it will return an error. If it isn't, it will fail silently though. So the plugin and the add-on isn't going to crash everything. But if it is over 2 kilobytes, maybe make smaller flashcards. And yeah, it just sends it off to the terminal server to be parsed by the templating engine. Now, what am I doing over here? So the thing is that if I wanted to make this as generic as possible, because of the fact that Anki notes could look like anything, I can't have some very hyper-specific templating that's going on. So what we're doing right now is that basically in configuration, we have this thing for visible fields. Visible fields is in your Anki notes. If you press browse and you're looking under notes, you have these things which are the names of the fields. So I'm looking at Anki Jazz right now, I guess, but if I go into essentialism, so you have like sentence, word, meaning, things like that. Now, these things you will list in visible fields, and it'll go through the array in order and grab the data that's inside of these fields, including the HTML. So there's like styling that you could see here. It grabs all of it. But basically, when it finds a note, it checks to see if the field is inside of the visible field array, and if it is, it'll just add it into the payload in the order that's listed in the visible fields. So what you get in this example situation is that if a card has the word term, it'll be added. If it doesn't have the definition note field, then that gets skipped. And if it has the sentence field, then it gets added. And it gets added, of course, in the order that's listed. So term will always appear above sentence. And if you have cards that only have one of these fields, like you'll only display one thing, things like that. So that's how I'm making this super generic so that it works with any type of Anki card, and it makes it work with any type of layout or styling you might have with the Anki cards. Because in the template itself, in the terminal plugin, I am not escaping the HTML at all. So we are keeping the styling of the card when it gets reflected into terminal. Again, Is that good? Is that bad? I guess it depends on the types of cards you have. My cards, fairly basic, so doesn't really matter much. I don't know how involved people get with styling their cards. I know that like it can get fairly crazy though. So over here in the code, we basically have a function to decompress the text. And I don't know, it's just doing a bunch of decompression stuff. Again, this was taken from the TRMNL Japanese plugin. So after the compression, we just populate the HTML. So we just dynamically generate spans, and they'll be just, you know, listed in order that they were listed in the visible fields thing. And that is how this TRMNL plugin Anki add-on combination thing was made. Now, you could do a lot of things differently for this. I refer to the fact that you could have, if you self-host your own server, some kind of endpoint that exposes your Anki collection. Your Anki collection is, by itself, a SQLite file. So you could just read directly from the SQLite file. Of course, then you have to worry about, like, how to update the fucking thing. But, you know, it's something that you could theoretically do. Anki, you can sync it to the cloud, to the Anki cloud using Anki Web, right? That's the thing. But they intentionally do not have some public API because of people like me who might fuck shit up. So that's why you basically have to do everything yourself. I'm very appreciative for Fusoft for making the Anki Connect API, which I did not use here, but it's super helpful for people who only know JavaScript, or people who really do not want to make a native Anki plugin. Anyways, that's it for now. The code is on my GitHub. You can install the Anki add-on. It's uploaded onto the Anki shared thingy, whatever it's called. And also the TRMNL plugin. To be able to import it, you need to download the zip file that's on the GitHub as well. But everything is in the description of the links. And if you want to buy TRMNL, there's a code in the description as well. And also, ask me questions or give me suggestions on things to do in Japan using the marshmallows. And I'll catch you guys later. Mata ne. And they just announced a new device right before I start recording this. God damn it. I'm probably gonna need to update this plugin if they made any changes.